Welcome to Bold Speak. I'm Anthony Creedon. Thanks for joining me as we continue with our Reclamation series with our third lesson of Reclamation Sin. Now, on this episode, what we're going to do is we're going to take all the information that we've gathered so far about sin, and we're going to kind of pull it together to create a more complete picture of sin so that we can address the issue of today, which is the problem of sin. How does it work? How does it operate? And specifically in association with the idea of idolatry. But before we get too far into that, let's quickly review a little bit about what we've covered so far. Sin is anything that is a violation of the will of God. That is, sin causes division. It creates separation. It makes us hide from each other and be afraid to be vulnerable and open with each other. It keeps us from having quality and solid relationships with other people. And so now, original sin refers to the persistence of sin in our lives, the persistence of separation in our lives as a result of the sin of Adam and Eve. That is to say that Adam and Eve's violation of the will of God has an ongoing effect for all future generations of humanity. And that means concupiscence is the sinful desire to sin. And that even our desire to want to do things that are our own will and not God's is sinful and condemnable in and of itself. Okay, you got all that? All right, remember that sin creates this separation between us and God and us and other people. And then, to make matters worse, sin takes the will of God and twists it to create in us this sinful desire to keep on sinning. And that's concupiscence. It's a pretty bleak picture of the reality of sin in our lives. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but it's about to get worse. It's going to get worse because today we're going to take all this information that we have about sin and we're going to plug it into the rest of Scripture, and we're going to see the real problem of sin. What is sin actually doing in our lives? Now, we're going to do this by taking a look at idolatry. All right. Now, some of you may be familiar with the term idolatry and how it works. Some of you may not, but I really do believe that understanding idolatry is the key to understanding the problem of sin. All right, now to understand idolatry, we're going to take a look at the Bible, and specifically we're going to look at the 10 Commandments that's found in Exodus chapter 20. The first commandment is verses 4 through 6, and that's the commandment that discusses and addresses idolatry. All right, so we're going to focus our attention there. But before we jump too far into that, there's a couple of things that we need to first establish about the 10 Commandments so we can better understand what's going on here. Now, for those of you who have been following along with the podcast that's available to you through SoundCloud or iTunes, you can listen there. We've been going through the book of Galatians. And one of the things that we've been focusing on is the law and the reality of the law in our lives and what the law is. Now, in that podcast, what we did is we took a look at the law as being kind of understood in two ways. First, we understand the law as natural law. And natural law is just saying that God created the world to operate and to work a certain way. He built the laws, he constructed everything to follow a line with his will. And then we looked at the law as divine or expressed law. Now, divine or expressed law is just a verbal expression of natural law, what God created. So divine or expressed law is a reflection of natural law, okay? And so what we're getting here in the 10 Commandments is divine or expressed law. It's just God telling us the way that he built things to operate, right? And the second thing we need to understand is something that many people don't know or realize, but the 10 Commandments are actually ordered in a very specific way for very specific reasons. And so the first commandment is the first commandment for a reason. Okay? So those two things we need to kind of keep in our heads as we get into this here. Now, there's a whole lot more that I could say about the law, and maybe sometime I will. Maybe that's a topic for a future study. But for now, let's just kind of focus on verses 4 through 6 and see what God says specifically about idolatry. All right, now again, I'm going to be reading from the English Standard Version of the Bible. All right, this is verses 4 through 6 of Exodus chapter 20. It says this: "You shall not make for yourself a carved image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and the fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. All right, and there it is. That is basically the premise of idolatry. Idolatry is anything to which we devote ourselves that replaces God in our lives. All right? And most people think about kind of another religion, but it's more than that. It could be money, it could be comfort, it could be relationships, or worse, it could be ourselves. The nature of idolatry is that it kind of gets in the way of God, and we devote ourselves, or we follow that in place of God. Now, this is where this kind of comes into play, and this is why this commandment on idolatry is the first commandment. Because what we see is that all sins, right, the rest of the 10 commandments and everything else that goes kind of according to the will of God, right, all of that falls under the first commandment, all right? And specifically what we're going to say is this: a violation of any commandment is a violation of the first. That is to say, all sin is a sin of idolatry. See, basically what's happening here is when we sin, when we break the will of God, what we're saying to God is, God, I know that you have a will. I know that you have a desire for how we're to live. I know that you created the world to work a certain way, but I don't want to follow your will. I want to follow my will. And so I want to do things my way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take your will, right, and the way that you created the world to work, your law, and I'm going to kind of place it over here, and I'm going to kind of do my own thing for a while. And so every time we sin, we make our will more important than God's will. And that is to say, we become more and more self-reliant. All right? And what that does is it creates more and more separation between us and God. And this is where we start to get to the real problem of sin. Now, I've taught several different places all over the country, and in places that I've taught people, and we've talked about the reality of sin in the world. One question that I've asked many is this, and it seems to stump a lot of people or kind of gives them pause to consider. Okay, so it's this question: if good works don't save you, then do bad works, sins, acts of sin, condemn you? Right? So if good works don't save you, do bad works or acts of sin condemn you? And like I said, many times when I ask that question, people sort of pause and think, because we've talked a lot in the church about salvation and grace and these kinds of things. We have a relatively good idea about the premise of those things. Even if we're not the best at living them out, we have a general idea of kind of the premise of those. But sin is a completely different thing. Have we really stopped to consider sin and what it does? All right, so that's the question I've asked. Here's the answer. You ready? If good works don't save us, and they don't, then the answer is no. Individual acts of sin don't condemn you. Well, if that's the case, then what is the real issue of sin? The real issue and problem of sin is idolatry. So remember we said that every time you sin, you kind of create this separation from God. You follow your own will and not God's will. And when that happens repeatedly over the course of your life, eventually it just kind of continues to increase that distance to the point where you're like, you know what? I don't need you, God. Right? I got my own will. Things are going fine by my own way. I'm not even sure I want a relationship with you or even need a relationship with you. And this is where idolatry kind of reaches its pinnacle or its peak in sin, because this is the problem. You ready? The problem with sin is that sin kills faith. Right? Eventually, when you say, I don't need you, God, I don't need a relationship with you, at that point, you don't have a relationship with God because you've pushed away his gifts, you've pushed away his presence in your life. And if you don't have faith in a relationship with God, you don't have the hope of salvation. And that's the real problem with sin. Now, I know some of you may be thinking to yourself, well, okay, hold on, wait. there's some things we have to address here, right? Like in the Gospel of John, right, chapter 10, Jesus says, I'm the good shepherd, right? The sheep, they know my voice, right? And no one can steal them from my hand. So how is it exactly that works, that kind of sin kills faith? And what's the reality of that there? How does that operate? That's a great question, and something we're going to get to in the next episode. All right, so I encourage you to tune in to the next episode. We're going to talk about that. In fact, what we're going to talk about is the nature of temptation in the life of sin and how it works. And we're also going to talk a little bit about Satan, right, and how Satan kind of plays in here. Okay, and that's the question that you have for your thoughts down at the bottom of your study guide in regard to Satan. What do you think is kind of how he works there? All right, so if you haven't had a chance to pick up that study guide, I encourage you to do so. You can do that on our website, www.theboldspeak.com. Go to our shop. There you can purchase it for just $3, and you can kind of track along with us and kind of get some of your thoughts down. All right, now make sure you also subscribe to this channel, all right? Subscribe so you can get the latest information and you can learn kind of when new episodes are released and so on and so forth. Also connect with us on social media, all right? Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all at /TheBoldSpeak. All right, I'm super glad to have you join me. Really look forward to our next lesson. Until then, everyone, I'm Anthony Creedon, and that is The Bold Speak.